Hi, everybody. It's time for the closing ceremonies of the conference and the workshop. My name is Mark Lubell, and I am a professor here at UC Davis and one of the co-PIs on the Climate Change, Water, and Society IGRT program, and I work on the social science aspects of it. And what we're going to do right now is we're going to have report backs from each of the breakout rooms, some of the main points from our three group leaders here. And then after that, an opportunity for anybody who wants to make any final closing statements or questions on the microphones out here to say their last bit. And then I'll say a few more comments about some thank yous, and we will be off to happy hour. So with that, let's go ahead and start with Jorge on the report back from the modeling session. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jorge. I was the guy holding the dog there. So I apologize for having to read the slide, but we generated this stuff interactively, which was a lot of fun. And I'm going to summarize to you some of the points that came up. And these are not all of the important points, but these are some of the points that I chose from the hydroclimate modeling and monitoring session that we just had. So one of the major things that came up in a lot of the discussions, this came up over and over again, was the idea that we need better data collection and we need better quality in the data that we collect in order to incorporate that into hydroclimate models or really any type of model. And in particular, for the modeling types, what we would like is high spatial and temporal resolution from that data. Also, another interesting point that came up regarding data collection is the idea of, am I too close to the mic? Oh, sorry. Is the idea of incentives that either make data more or less available to climate modelers or hydroclimate modelers. And there are some interesting socio-economic and political nuances to that could be further discussed. Another point was that we would like better remote sensing. There was some discussion about the spacecraft Grace, and I think the consensus here was that we want more of it. We want higher resolution, better spacecraft, better remote sensing networks out there that are going to help us collect data. One other point in terms of the connection between the developers of hydroclimate models and users is the idea of knowing when is a hydroclimate model appropriate. In what situations do we want to apply complete, complex hydroclimate integrated models, and how do people, especially policymakers and managers, how do they know when to use these models and how to categorize them in order for it to be useful to them? And another point, the technical point that came up from this was the challenge that we face in trying to resolve the interfaces between some of the traditional disciplines that we all study. So if you're a climate scientist, if you're a hydrologist, if you study land surface processes, how do we quantify, how do we describe the interfaces between all those components of the climate system in order to be able to create better hydroclimate models? And that typically comes down to quantifying fluxes between those systems. So again, that was not everything that came up out of that particular workshop, but some of the interesting technical points and some of the points that maybe had some policy and management implications that may be important and could lead to further discussion. So again, thank you very much, Reed Maxwell and Claudia Font. They were our speakers during that workshop, and I'll pass it on to James.
I'm just going to go from up here. We had a lot of great discussion and a lot of different perspectives in the conjunctive use and managed aquifer recharge session. I tried to summarize the points that we came up with within the group into two main categories, so sort of the science aspect and the policy aspect. We talked a lot about what needs to happen to make things like managed aquifer recharge a better strategy for dealing with water supply issues and how that relates to climate change and groundwater. Under the science aspect, one of the big things that I heard from a couple of the groups was just trying to better quantify the ins and the outs of the system, particularly in confined aquifer systems. So trying to figure out how much water, if we're putting water in the ground, how much of that is getting into the confined systems where pumping may be happening. Another part related to that is looking at costs associated with building up infrastructure and how to optimize things like making this easier for a municipality or some other agency to put in place. And having a better idea of the costs makes those sorts of things easier. Under the policy section, there was a lot of talk, a lot of discussion about trying to make more consistency across state agencies. At least at the table that I was sitting at, there was a lot of concern with getting all the state agencies and the regional boards all on the same table so that there was a coordinated approach to looking at and regulating water from a quality standpoint as well as a quantity standpoint. And I was, I guess I was impressed by the barrier that presented to some people in different parts of the state. So I found that very interesting. Another couple of suggestions were more flexibility in permitting, particularly in allowing agencies or municipalities more time to set up a more flexible infrastructure and ability to conduct managed aquifer recharge. And another theme that was throughout most of the suggestions that each group came up with was coming up with incentives to make managed aquifer recharge an easier option. And part of that was including managed aquifer recharge as a beneficial use. And like with Jorge, that was just a brief overview, and there was a lot of great ideas out there, and thank you everybody in that session for contributing. And with that, I will turn it over to Amanda.
Great, so we also had a lot of discussion, quick bullet points here, but you'll hear more from us later. So in the overdraft and regulation, managing for sustainability, we had Jeff Lux and Tim Quinn kick it off. So different ideas emerged at the different tables about how we can use and expand on existing legislation to have better groundwater outcomes without having to reinvent the wheel. So there are things out there that if we tweak them and add language, add more power for local agencies, we can sort of move forward in that way. Another thing that was sort of consistent across the tables was really thinking about what are the management units. So it should really be hydrologically defined boundaries for basin management decisions. This could mean creating new regional authorities, but it could also mean using existing watershed boundaries like the integrated regional water management plans or the water quality control board regions. A third point is thinking about how land use and groundwater planning have strong connections. So one way this would be requiring a water element in your general county plans. So you could have a big land use change would then be required to have a will serve letter that would let you, or at least prove that you've planned for watershed changes when you're making these big land use changes. And similarly, make sure that the state water plan considers land use planning as they're moving forward. A fourth point is that we really need to know how much is out there, how much is being used, and this means that we really need to synthesize and make transparent existing data that we have so that our policy decisions can be that much more informed by science and technical knowledge that already exists. And then our last point was thinking about the language that we use in legislation, in policies, and public outreach. So one example that came up was the idea of equilibrium. It can be talked about in terms of institutional developments, but not in terms of resources. Another example would be to abandon the use and the conception of groundwater as a source. It needs to be thought about as a managed basin, and this would require some cultural shift in thinking about the way that we relate to groundwater. So that's sort of our summary points.
Okay, thank you very much. Would anybody like to approach any of the microphones or raise their hands? It looks like the microphones are going around the room to make any last comments about any of these sessions, things that might have been left out, important points you'd like to make, questions that you would like to ask. If you ask a question, anybody in the answer, we have a room full of many experts here, may be able to answer that question. So raise your hand, don't be shy. Jeff.
So two quick points that kind of came up in our session. One is that we talk about and there's a pretty good consensus that management of groundwater, aggressive management will probably happen, or a little bit more bottoms up, but local or regional kind of management. Everyone tends to agree with that. Oh, here we go. Tends to agree with that, but I just want to point out that some of the big groundwater overdraft problems are not just local. In fact, they affect the whole state. So when you think about the southern San Joaquin Valley's long-term groundwater overdraft and subsidence and other problems, it has had and continues to have significant impacts, influences, and policy changes across the state's water landscape, not just in that region. So even though management locally makes sense, and makes sense to me, some of these problems are statewide kinds of issues and problems to consider.
Okay, any other comments or questions, closing comments or questions? Or is everybody tired? One thing that I think was said in our session is the importance of clarifying the role of the state with respect to whatever changes in groundwater management will be made. Do we need state legislation? Do we need to use existing legislation? Should it be an administrative process? Should it be an incentives to go through adjudication? That sort of thing. It's, there's a lot of options on the table for the state to go through, and figuring out what those options are is an important piece of the puzzle, clarifying them. What else? Does anybody else have any other closing comments?
This morning's speakers opened up the box pretty well, indicating that we have problems dealing with the demand side. We've been kind of fooling around with the supply side, but we really have difficulty limiting demand. And I wonder if any of the discussions this afternoon brought out more perspective on how we can get at the demand side of the problem, and whether the other states, perhaps, such as, I don't know, Colorado or New Mexico or Arizona, whether their systems or their regulatory strategies are being helpful from the demand side rather than just the supply. Any insights?
Anybody want to take that one up?
Are we going to leave here stymied regarding the demand problem? Or we just have to leave that with the CWA students for them,
Yes.
them to figure out?
I'm sensing that people are ready to go to happy hour, so
There was one point brought up at my table, actually, and I don't think he's here anymore, but he was talking about that as far as urban use, about half of that water is used for landscape watering. And so one thing that people don't talk about, if you talk about demand side, there's not much we can convince agriculture to squeeze out of what they're demanding. So what if we did an urban to ag, if we started talking about that and somehow was able to reduce, say, watering our landscape and transferring that water to ag as one thing. Yeah. Jeff said using urban recycled water as well.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting thing. So I'm also part of a center called Renewal, which is partnered with Berkeley, Stanford, and School of Mines and New Mexico State. And we're interested in understanding urban water renewal and urban infrastructure. And irrigation, urban irrigation, lawn watering water, it's more than half. It's actually the majority of the water use. And it's interesting too, looking as an outsider, because Colorado, we've had our fair share of droughts, of course, as well. We're actually getting a lot of water this year, but next year all bets could be off. But looking sort of at California and a lot of the personal conservation measures that are really interesting, but they seem very minor compared to large-scale watering efficiency in the urban setting and ag water usage. I think that's an interesting question too. Very much a personal behavior type question.
So I think we had a hand up here, and then I'll come to you next. Sorry.
You're next.
Great. I just take this chance to make a couple points. One is I'm hoping I can get people to understand that the basins that have the most news-breaking problems, where there's land subsidence or where there's wells drying up, and those are very important, but that's kind of a cooked deal. That's done. And I would almost suggest that it's a simpler problem than some of the basins that we think of as water-rich, like the Sacramento Valley. Because the more we pump out of Sacramento Valley, not only do we impact the environment, we impact surface water rights, which means we impact the water rights of 35 million people that are depending on exports from the Delta. And I feel like that gets a short shrift, that we're not getting it. And the state's prioritization of the basins, and when I heard Jeff talking earlier, we keep looking at these heavily drawn down basins as being where we got to run to and fix. And I'm trying to make the point, and TNC's making this point, we got to go to the basins that are healthy and set these rules up now. Otherwise, we're just going to let them get to be a problem and then have to deal with it, and the salmon will be gone, and the water rights will be all disrupted. So that's the major point I just wanted to make again.
Thank you. I think we're right here, Katie.
The emphasis on land use is something that I consider critical. Land use is the primary resource that gives us the ability to adapt to climate change and to deal with water use. And it's the only resource in California that doesn't have an oversight and enforceable watchdog agency. And it has an advisory, if you will, Governor's Office of Planning and Research. There's an opportunity for urban land use to avoid costs in terms of expanding infrastructure that benefits the groundwater management. And I'm a little confused about why some people don't think that there should be what's typically called a public use charge for water, because every other resource in California has one. And to depend on a secure source of funding really does take something other than a general fund that's subject to year-on-year appropriations and legislative action. And then finally, those avoided costs can also not only benefit the urban community, but they should be shared benefits to the agricultural community, so that the agricultural community is paid for the services that it offers in terms of floodplain management, groundwater management, some water quality issues also. And that conversation could be incorporated and enveloped in the groundwater discussion, because one of the funding mechanisms for groundwater management clearly could be from the urban sector, and at a fairly small cost compared to a lot of the other costs that they have to deal with. And just to let people know who don't know, I'm an elected mayor of the city of Benicia, so when I say that it's a small cost, I'm very keenly aware of what my constituents think about paying for water.
Thank you very much. Any responses or other comments? Okay, well, with that, I would just like to a couple closing comments to everybody. First of all, thank you very much for all of your participation here. We have a very diverse set of people here, and It's been a very inspiring for me to see everybody engaged in these conversations, so thanks a lot. And also thanks to all the students, the IGERT students, both in Cohort 1 and Cohort 2, and the staff of the IGERT who helped us organize this, Carol Holm and Elizabeth Scholl. So if we could just quickly give them a hand, I think they did a great job. Thank you very much for that. And this right here is actually your text input developed into a word cloud. We'll do a little bit more analysis of this sort of stuff as part of the deliverables from this conference and report back to you guys after the fact. But as you can see here, groundwater and water management in California is really complex, and to solve these problems takes a lot of integration across all of these concepts and cooperation among many of the stakeholders that are involved. So, I'll say something also that Mark Twain never did say, which is not the usual statement, but I will say it in a different way, which is whiskey is for fighting and water is for cooperation. And the question is, how do we make that happen? And what we're trying to do with our IGERT program is create a generation of researchers who are comfortable playing in this word cloud, who understand from the science and policy perspective how to integrate, are open to this sort of integration, this sort of cooperation from the very beginning of their careers. And it's not just this first cohort or the second cohort, but 5 cohorts, a generation of students who want to work in agencies, who want to work in universities, who want to cross the science and policy divide to make this happen. So we're really looking for your help in doing that. These students are looking for internships, advice. If you have any feedback about how we're doing this conference or projects that you think we might want to work on, find one of the IGERT organizers or students and contact us. We're happy to continue these interfaces afterwards. Please fill out the survey that we have in your packet. There's a paper survey which you can fill out now and return it. And there's a box or give it to one of us and we'll put it in the box. We will also be emailing an electronic version of that survey if you don't have time to do it today. And the last thing is just there's a poster session and a reception outside. The reception is catered by Dos Coyotes and there's a cash bar. And with that, thanks a lot. And next year, we will be doing this conference again. We're not sure exactly what the topic will be, but it'll be the 3rd year of the cohort, and we hope to see as many people as can come next year. So thanks a lot, and have a good evening.